I'm still not done talking about the Copernican revolution, and in this video I want to try a somewhat different approach. In this approach I've been very much influenced by reading an article by Stephen Engstrom called Knowledge and Its Object. It's from this book, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a critical guide by James R. O'Shea. But the article, as I said, is by Stephen Engstrom. Now, I'm not going to claim that what I say in this video is what Engstrom says. I wouldn't even know whether he really agrees with what I'm going to say, but the article has really inspired me to make this video, and I think it would be only fair to say that in advance. Okay, I'm going to approach the Copernican revolution from yet a different angle, because I think it will help us understand some of the elements of Kant's system that otherwise may seem to come out of the blue. It also, I suspect, helps us understand the relationship between Kant and some of his successors, but it's definitely going to help us when we read the Critique of Pure Reason to understand terms like spontaneity, to understand some of the things that Kant is going to say about reason and its ideals in the second half of the critique. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to argue that it's going to help us understand something that he says at the beginning of the introduction. So let's start from the following question. What is objective knowledge? Right? Knowledge about an object, objective knowledge. What is objective knowledge? Now, here is sort of a standard approach to that question, or a standard answer to that question. It is to say that we have objective knowledge of something when we have, in a sense, a copy of that thing in our mind. When our mind is the mirror of nature, that is when we have objective knowledge. And so the problem, like the big epistemological problem facing modern philosophy, is the question, well, how can we know that our mind is a good mirror? Right? If knowledge is a good mirroring of reality, of the object, how can we know that our mind can actually do that? How can we know that our mind is a fair, good mirror and not a clouded or distorting mirror? And it's really hard, as we have seen, to give an answer to that. So if to know is to mirror, then it's hard to see how the problem of reality can be solved. And now here is Kant, and Kant is going to tell us that to know is definitely not to mirror. And it is pretty easy to say why you would want to see why you would want to say that, right? And here is one way maybe to start seeing that. You know what a really good mirror, what is a really good mirror of reality? A mirror. But a mirror doesn't have knowledge, right? Even though a mirror is really good at mirroring reality, it doesn't have knowledge. Okay, so why doesn't a mirror have knowledge? Well, presumably, I mean, we would say something like, well, you know, it's not conscious, or it doesn't think, it's not a subject. Okay, but, I mean, all of that is probably true, right? All of that is probably, these are probably the right answers, but why are they the right answers? What is it about thinking or consciousness or being a subject? Why would that be a necessary element of knowledge, a necessary precondition of knowledge, if to know is just to mirror? Now, quite in general, I mean, even if we just add something like consciousness, it would still seem to be not the case that to just have a kind of picture or copy of reality in your mind is enough to have knowledge, right? I mean, this is a kind of thinking that I think especially the empiricists tend to fall into. Hume, for instance, goes as far as to say that to believe something is just to have a very vivid picture of it in your mind, and then presumably if that picture mirrors reality in the right way, then that would be knowledge. But that is not really what knowledge is. In order to know something, we have to take up what we are given in sense perception. We have to take up what is given in sense perception, and then we have to compare it with and put it into a hole where it has to fit. And if it doesn't fit, then we have to make a judgment, a negative judgment about it, and discard it. Right? So what I'm saying is that even if something is given to us in sense perception, it is only turned into knowledge through a process that has to do with fitting whatever is given to us into a larger whole. Right, and here's one way maybe to see that. Suppose that I quickly glance at that side of the room and I perceive a cow. Like, not a picture of a cow, a real cow. And I just see it from the corner of my eye. I'm like, what? Is there a cow? I mean, this is just a study, right? I'm not here in a farm. And so I turn around in shock while all of you watch me, and I look, and there's no cow there at all, right? And in fact, the door is closed. I smell no dung. Maybe I run to the door, I open it, but there's no cow in the corridor or on the staircase. I mean, I am on the second floor here. I'm on the third floor here if you're an American. There was no cow, right? That's the right judgment. Even though maybe I thought I saw a cow, the right judgment is that I didn't see a cow. How do I know? Well, I compare this impression of the cow with this entire web of my knowledge, of my beliefs about the world, which involve, the nature of cows, where they can be found, how they can move, whether they can suddenly disappear. No, they can't. I combine all of that and I conclude, I judge, there was no cow. And this is, of course, only a particularly obvious example of something that we do all the time. Right? All the time we are getting input that we're not just putting into like a store, like a storehouse where we put all the input that we've ever had next to each other, and that is our knowledge of the world. Not at all. What we do is we are continually active. We are continually doing something. We are continually fitting all of this together, making generalizations from it, testing those generalizations against the observations and the observations against the generalizations, seeking to fill the gaps, coming up with hypotheses, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I think that once we start seeing this, once we start seeing that knowledge is way more, and in fact something totally different from being a mirror of reality, right? That is when we can start understanding Kant. And for instance, we can start understanding a sentence that this appears in the introduction, the B introduction. It's on B5, and we're not at the introduction yet, but we will be very, very soon. It's on B5, and there Kant says the following about the need for a priori principles of cognition. He's going to tell us that we need a priori principles of cognition. Why? Well, for where would experience itself get its certainty if all rules in accordance with which it proceeds were themselves in turn always empirical, thus contingent? And if you have anything like a copy idea of experience, like to experience something is just like a copy appears in your mind, then this is a very mysterious sentence indeed. Because why does Kant talk about rules for experience? And why does he say that experience proceeds in accordance with rules? But all of that becomes totally clear and obvious once we start to think of knowledge and of experience, which is, this process where we get sensory impressions and then do something with them. Once we start understanding that as an activity, right? We need rules in experience for deciding, for judging whether to deal, how to deal, and whether to deal, I guess, with the sense impressions that we get, with the affectations by the objects, with the ways that the objects impress themselves on us. We've got to decide whether there is an object, whether what we've seen is realistic, right? I mean, we know that in many instances, what we experience, is distorted. We know it, and we can make amendments for that. We do this all the time, right? You look at my clothes in this yellowish light, and you're like, oh, that's not their real color, right? You know that. You know those kinds of things. Okay, so Kant is quite right to insist on this, that there are rules for experience, and that experience proceeds because it's an activity. Now, one of the core words maybe that Kant is going to use here, a word that we are going to see quite a lot, is that Kant repeatedly tells us that the understanding, our use of concepts, is a faculty of spontaneity. Spontaneity. So what does that mean? Well, at least it means that it is active. It is doing something, right? It is determining itself. It is not just passive. Like Kant has spontaneity on the one hand and receptivity on the other hand. And sense impression is like its receptivity, right? We get something, but then we do something with it, right? There's also always spontaneity going to be involved in experience, and definitely in knowledge. We do something, and it's not just random, right? It's not just a process. So I'm saying here that it's an activity, not just a process, right? A process is something that happens in time, maybe according to certain laws, according to certain mechanisms, right? You could have a sort of mechanical or like a mechanical scientific story about how the brain or the mind works. That's the kind of story that Hume is giving us. And I would say that Kant doesn't think that Hume really grasps the spontaneity of the mind, and that Kant has very real reasons to use the word rule. Right? A rule is something that that you've got to apply, right? Something that you've got to reason about, something that has a goal. I think this is the central distinction between a mere process and an activity, right? If something is just happening, a ball is rolling down an inclined plane, that's a process. It's not really an activity. If I am making this video, that's an activity. It has a goal. I want to teach you Kant. Everything I do is pointed towards that goal. Knowledge too, knowing too, the activity of cognition too, is pointed at a goal. Human cognition is teleological. It is pointed at a goal. It's a goal-directed activity. And its goal is, this grand unified grasp of reality. It is an activity of unification. We are given all these things. We are given all these elements from sense perception, and we're going to do something with them, right? We're going to bring them together. We're going to unify them. We're going to fit them. We're going to compare them, whether they fit, then we're going to fit them. We're going to create links between them. We're going to try to generalize. We're going to try to expand and expand and expand our knowledge, fill up the gaps, go further towards the past, maybe further towards the future, further away. Knowledge is an activity that seeks for a goal which is sort of total understanding of the world. Knowledge, we could say, is a kind of life, right? A kind of life, a living activity with an aim. It is always moving from one place to another. It's always moving from relative ignorance to relative knowledge, which of course it recognizes as, again, relative ignorance compared to some further goal, some next step where it wants to go. It sees itself, it knows itself as always growing towards more knowledge. And so human cognition is always self-conscious of its finitude, of the fact that it doesn't know everything, that there are these gaps and limits and uncertainties, and it's always striving to push at those limits, right? And make itself bigger and make itself better, even though it doesn't perhaps have any guarantee of ever arriving at that goal. Okay, so that is sort of the basic picture of knowing that I think Kant is working with. Now, Kant is going to insist, and we will see this in a lot of detail, that this movement of knowledge requires both, we could say, internal and external factors, right? Both spontaneity and receptivity. Objects have to be given to us, and then our spontaneity is going to, go to work on that, is going to create knowledge out of that. And whether we can understand these two terms, like even on their own, or whether they're always connected, those are important and difficult questions of Kant scholarship. But we definitely need both of them. Spontaneity and receptivity, according to Kant, are both needed for human cognition. Now, those external factors, right, where we get in touch with the objects, where the objects affect us, they must enable knowledge. And now I'm going to cite Engstrom. They must be affectations of a receptivity that belongs to the cognitive capacity itself. Right? Our receptivity has to be part of our capacity for knowledge. Otherwise, its relation to the capacity for knowledge can't be understood, doesn't make any sense. What is given to us in receptivity is precisely the material for the capacity of knowledge, the capacity for knowledge, right? I mean, these are not two different things. They are inherently related. So, we need affectations of a receptivity that belongs to the cognitive capacity itself. And Engstrom also writes, just as the cognizing subject is originally conceived as bearer of the capacity to know, the cognized object is originally conceived as bearer of the capacity to be known. So maybe we can say it like this. Our concept of the object is the material on which our cognitive activity is employed. It is that which is to be fitted, that which is to be unified. And our conception of the subject, and I think we're going to find that this really is the way that Kant thinks about it, our conception of the subject of ourselves is as that which unifies these objects, right? The subject is the great unifier, is that which does this activity of knowing, this unification that is knowledge. So, in summary, to know is not to mirror, to know is to unify, and the subject is the unifier, the object is that which is to be unified, or that which results from the in a sense that which is going to result or be revealed by, maybe that's the right way to say it, the activity of unifying. So what does all of this have to do with the Copernican turn? Because I promised to talk about the Copernican turn. Well, this is Copernican because what we are doing here is we are understanding the world of objects in terms of our own activity of knowing. Right? We start our story by talking about the activity of knowing. That's where we have to start. We don't start with the idea of a reality independent of us and our ways of knowing. We start by thinking about the activity of knowing, and then we understand that objects, that the world is essentially that which is revealed in the activity of knowing, with which we get in touch in the activity of knowing. And so this solves the problem of reality. Because, yes, there are standards of correctness. I mean, there are standards of getting things right or getting things wrong. So it's not just like a bad subjectivism in which objective knowledge isn't possible because we just believe whatever we want to believe and then that is the truth. There are standards of correctness, standards of reality, but they are internal to this process of knowledge itself. Right? To be right is not to have adequately mirrored some reality that is independent of us and our minds and our ways of knowing. To be right is to have achieved successful unification, is to have achieved the goal that knowledge is always moving towards, and that knowledge can only understand itself as being the moving towards. And of course, we also see why Kant would want to call this position an idealism, because we start from our own activity of knowledge, and that is sort of the core element here. So, I think this way of thinking about the Copernican revolution is really going to help us moving forward, because Kant is actually going to have a lot to say about. He's going to have a lot to say about spontaneity. He's going to have a lot to say about like the role of the understanding in experience, things which I think fit the story that we've just told very well. He's also going to have to say a lot about the goals that reason points us towards. Right? He's going to think of reason in the narrow sense, as that which always pushes us in this process of knowledge to go further, right? To push our boundaries further and further and further. And that is precisely where the problems of philosophy come from. Because reason, it always wants to push further, but it never reaches its goal. And so there is a sort of inherent temptation in reason to try to get to the goal in one fierce leap that takes us beyond experience. And that is where, according to Kant, things are going to go horribly wrong. So, okay. Two more things I want to say about that. One thing is that I think that if you think about Kant in this way, and if you know a little, I mean, even just a little bit about the philosophy that follows after Kant, it becomes a lot easier to see why we would think of somebody like Hegel as somebody who is a successor of Kant. And I have to pause this video in order to open the door. So, back again. So when we, like, a lot of standard stories about Kant, if you read that and then you hear the standard story about Hegel, where he has this idea about, oh, there is an absolute spirit which throughout history is moving towards knowledge of itself, might make you think, well, what do these two thinkers have to do with each other? But once we start thinking of Kant as somebody who departs from the idea that knowledge is an activity that is always moving towards greater insight into the world, greater insight into itself, and that we have to understand the world in terms of this knowing, this process of knowing, then the connection with Hegel suddenly becomes a lot easier to see, right? And the second thing I want to say here at the end is that Engstrom, Stephen Engstrom, in his article, gives a pretty nice explanation for why philosophers before Kant fell into the mistake of thinking that knowledge has to be some kind of mirroring relation, right? So when we look at the object of knowledge, it is sort of this thing that has to be fitted into our picture of the world. And so when we start thinking about the problem of reality, when we start thinking about the relation between human knowledge and the world, what we tend to do is we tend to take human knowledge as our object, right? There's the object in the world, which is an object, and there's human knowledge, which is also an object of our thinking now. And now we sort of try to fit both of them into the web of our knowledge. And by doing so, we are sort of taking up the subject as an object, right? We're trying to understand the subject in the kind of terms that we usually use in order to understand objects. And so knowledge is going to appear as something like a picture, rather than as something like a goal-directed activity, which is what it really is. And so we needed maybe Kant to either show that to us, or at least to sort of take that as the real starting point of philosophy and start drawing out its consequences. And that would be the Copernican revolution.